This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
We
are
cultivate.
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 We are cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay Valenti, and with me today, instead of my sister, is author and podcaster Kate Winkler Dawson. Kate is a seasoned documentary producer and podcaster whose hit podcasts Tenfold More Wicked, Wicked Words, and Buried Bones appear on the Exactly Right Network. She is the author of Death in the Air, American Sherlock, and All That Is Wicked, and is a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, Kate is joining us to discuss her latest book, The Sinners All Bow, which is set to be released January 7th. Acclaimed journalist, podcaster, and true crime historian Kate Winkler Dawson tells the true story of the scandalous murder investigation that became the inspiration for both Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and the first true crime book published in America. On a cold winter day in 1832, Sarah Maria Cornell was found dead in a quiet farmyard in a small New England town. When her troubled past and a secret correspondence with charismatic Methodist minister Reverend Ephraim Avery was uncovered, more questions emerged. Was Sarah's death a suicide or something much darker? Determined to uncover the real story, Victorian writer Catharine Read Arnold Williams threw herself into the investigation as the trial was unfolding and wrote what many claim to be the first American true crime narrative, Fall River. The murder divided the country and inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, but the Reverend was not convicted, and questions linger to this day about what really led to Sarah Cornell's death, until now. In The Sinners All Bow, acclaimed true crime historian Kate Winkler Dawson travels back in time to 19th century small-town America, emboldened to finish the work Williams started nearly 2 centuries before. Using modern investigative advancements, including forensic knot analysis and criminal profiling, which was invented 55 years later with Jack the Ripper, Dawson fills in the gaps of Williams's research to find the truth and bring justice to an unsettling mystery that speaks to our past as well as our present, anchored by 3 women who subverted the script they were given. So, Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we kind of dive into the book, what got you into writing?
Oh boy. I think in high school I had an English teacher who thought I was a pretty good writer. And I didn't know what kind of writing I wanted to do. And she did something really interesting. Boy, I've told this story enough where I really should reach out to Miss Terrell and tell her thank you for this. I mean, I keep talking about her, Jane Terrell in Austin. She decided that everybody in all of her 9th grade students needed to learn how to interview for a job, like an internship or anything, McDonald's, wherever you wanted to be. So she brought in all of these people who were in the professional world who were friends of hers. And one of them was a guy who managed a radio station here in Austin. And so he did a fake interview with me to, be an intern. And then at the end of the interview, I guess he thought I did a good job. And he said, do you want to actual job as an intern at my radio station? And I said, sure. And so then I ended up shifting over to television. And then I almost had no choice but to write news, because at 15, and 16, I was hired as an editor at the ABC station here. At that age, I was so used to being told what to do still by my parents. Oh, right. You want to write journalism? Okay. And here we go. I'm going to write journalism now. So I was pretty pigeonholed from the very beginning. And then of course I loved it. Thank goodness. So that's the lesson for any of your listeners who, have kids, is man, catch them early. Try to get them. I'm trying to get my girls to do that. Figure out now, because that's what keeps you out of trouble in high school kept me out of trouble because I just said, I definitely want to do this. I'm not going to screw it up by doing something stupid.
Exactly. That's the struggle I have with my 16-year-old is she doesn't know what she wants to do either, and it's hopefully she'll figure it out sooner rather than later, but,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
you
yeah.
know. So what inspired you to investigate the focus of the story, which is the
Mhm.
case of Sarah Maria Cornell?
My other books have been very male centric, which is sort of
Yep.
odd for me because I really do gravitate towards female centric stories. But the first three books, Looney Tunes Serial Killer, Stuck in a Fog was my first book. The second one was about a forensic scientist, American Sherlock. And then the third one was about, Edward Rulov, who was a genius, but not at getting away with crimes. So
Mhm.
for this fourth book, I thought I really need a woman at the center of it. And I write an awful lot about men killing women. And
Yep.
I had a listener when I had Tenfold, the podcast Tenfold More Wicked, I had a listener reach out to me and said, "You need to look at the haystack murders." And so I Googled it and I found Sarah's story. That is not the
Mhm.
haystack murder she was talking about. There's a completely different
Okay.
haystack murder that happened 100 years later in Kansas, I think. So, I when I read Sarah Cornell's story and I just sort of realized how similar it is to stories today. I mean, really, if you break down
Mhm.
her story, she is a
Yep.
woman who, is pregnant and she wants to do what's best for her child, and she
Yep.
is demanding rights, and then she ends up dead. And
Yep.
we know that women are out there most vulnerable when they're pregnant. Statistically, they just
Yep.
are vulnerable for being murdered. So, when I read that story on the podcast that I have with Paul Holes, Buried Bones, we talk about it all the time. Man, this just seems like this could have happened last week.
Yep.
This would have happened to
Exactly.
a modern day woman, absolutely. So to show that, as a story of Sarah Maria Cornell being the inspiration, of course, for Hester Prynne with the Scarlet Letter, and how much that resonates in it. What to me was terrifying about that story was, I'm looking for heroes, and I love looking for women heroes in these stories. And I found them with the women who recognized that she had not taken her life, most likely that she had,
Yep.
had violence put upon her. But then the villains of the story, really the villains, the true villains to me were women. And the awful people who took the stand
Yep.
and just destroyed her character for at the sake of protecting a really sleazy guy.
Yep.
So there was for me, a real mixed bag. I was so proud of some of the women in the story and completely disgusted by other women.
Exactly. As I was reading the book and you were discussing the trial and like the testimonies and stuff, I physically went like
Yeah.
throughout the book, just like so disgusted with some of the things these women were saying about her. And I'm like, why? So
Yeah.
it's, yeah.
Well, I mean, you saw in the book that I interviewed a woman an attorney who represents victims of sexual harassment, and she read the whole transcript of everything that the defense said about Sarah Maria Cornell. Basically, she's a slut, she's a thief, she can't be trusted, she was miserable, she set him up and
Yep.
and took her own life to frame him. And, the attorney in the book said, I mean, this is sort of like flowery 19th century language, but this is absolutely something that would come out of, a court case today. It wouldn't be allowed into most courts, but that is the thought process that is used by the defense, that she deserved it or she was vindictive
Yep.
defense.
In the book, you note that your co author is a woman named Catharine Read Arnold Williams.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little more about her and kind of the part she plays in this story as well?
Yeah, so it's interesting to have this kind of a co-author. She's a single mom, poet
Hmm.
turned journalist, and making her own way kind of through this world, trying to raise her daughter, by selling books and doing a great job. And she hears about the story of Sarah Maria Cornell and decides that she wants to write a book about it. And she has all of this amazing access, and I read her book about the story in the trial, and I thought this would be a fantastic co-author. Of course, the trick is that she's been dead for 150 years.
Yeah.
She
Yep.
wrote she wrote the country's first true crime book to me, which is a stunning revelation for me to have because, I think conventional wisdom is that Capote wrote kind of the first mainstream, In Cold Blood, which I have a
Yeah.
whole
Yep.
issue with. And then,
Yep.
really crime historians know about Edmund Pearson, who I adored, who wrote, in the 1920s, and he wrote true crime books. He really, to me, was sort of the beginning of that genre. But Catharine Williams decides in 1833 that she's gonna take up this case. She was so disgusted with the way that Sarah Maria Cornell was being treated after she died. I mean, quite frankly, she hated the Methodists. The Methodists were wild and out of
Mhm.
control, and Catharine Williams was a very conventional Christian woman, very conservative, and so it's an interesting juxtaposition for her to take up a case of a woman who, is being framed as promiscuous and deserved to be, to die, is unusual. I mean, Catharine Williams came from a very, very well-known family, the Arnold family.
Yep.
So, to kind of have her as this co-author where I was able to use all of her materials. She has an archive at Brown University. I met her descendant. It was her great-granddaughter, a great-great-granddaughter who was just amazing and gave me, access to letters I had never even heard of before. So, the flip side of that is I have all this modern technology. I had access to prosecutor notes that she had not. She had died by the time the notes from the prosecutor were released. So I had
Yep.
information she didn't have.
It's interesting, and I have to, like, go back and put on the lens of what it was like in history at that time, because as soon as I read about the Methodists, I was like, "Methodists? Like, they're really not that crazy." Like, I was raised Methodist, and I was like,
Oh my gosh.
What?" I was like, "What, they just sing a lot?" And then as
No,
I'm
lots
reading
of
the
sex.
story, I was like, apparently they were much more wild and crazy back in the day, but so it was, even for me, I was like, I can't even like fathom
Yeah,
this weird subsect, like,
I
which,
know. My
to be
agent did.
fair, would have been super shocking coming from like a Puritan lens as
Oh
well. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
so it's like night and day.
Somebody asked me what was the most surprising part of the book, and I said, I mean, that the Methodists who drink grape juice had these tent revivals where there was literally something called a tent baby because people got pregnant so often they called them tent
Oh God.
babies. And, I just it's so hard for me to believe that they were as evangelical as they were. I will say this was really funny. I should give this, I talked to this woman who interviewed me this morning, and she said that she had known American Sign Language, and she said the sign for American Sign Language for Methodists is rubbing your hands together. And she said, I never understood the significance of it. The significance of it was, she said, it was meant to show great enthusiasm. It's a
Okay.
very old sign. And so she said, that explains it. Your book explains why great enthusiasm, because she said modern Methodists, I'm not quite sure that enthusiastic, but she said they were obviously in the 1800s, and she said that the sign is a
Yeah.
very old sign, so it's funny, you don't understand the origin of certain phrases and everything, but she said, "Now that makes sense, because I did not think they were
Yeah.
enthusiastic, but apparently they were very
Way
enthusiastic."
back in the day, they were ragers apparently.
Yeah,
But yeah,
shocking. Yeah, and it
I
horrified
know.
Catharine Williams, who was just a very staunch Episcopalian, quiet and demure, and to have all of these people out there, women passed out and speaking in I know she was horrified by speaking in
Oh
tongues,
yeah.
and I didn't even think that would be I just didn't all of this, the description's crazy.
Yeah, it comes across as very sort of what today we would label as almost like Pentecostal as far
Yeah.
as like denominations. And so yeah, like even me reading the book, I was like, I that is not all at all what
I'm
Methodists are like today. Like,
The
that's
way that
crazy.
Catherine described a tent revival that she went to, before Sarah had been found, before she started on the
Yep.
book, and the way she was describing it with, like, people around the fire, it sounded almost pagan. Like, it was like
Yeah.
a pagan thing, and I just thought, "Man, this has to be overblown," but then I started reading other accounts of these tent revivals, and they would mix with with the crazy Baptists, those wild Baptists, and, so I'm not sure that was what John Wesley intended when he came to America, 50 to 70 years
Yeah.
earlier. I think that they
Yeah.
had gotten pretty wild, but so, the kind of centerpiece of that story is this fight between the Methodists who were trying to protect a minister, one of their ministers who's being accused of something terrible,
Yep.
and the Fall River, the factory owners who were predominantly Congregationalist, conservative, mainstream
Yep.
Protestants who just said, we can't have these men from the Methodist churches preying on our young girls who are working in the factories. And so,
Yep.
Ephraim Avery, the minister, and Sarah Cornell became avatars for these different religions. And I just had no clue how threatened churches can be, religious
Yeah.
movements can be. I didn't understand, and then I find out that the Methodist ministers were being tarred and feathered and they were very threatened. The mainstream Protestants were very threatened.
You also note, as you kind of mentioned already, the connection between Sarah Maria Cornell and Hester Prynne.
Yeah.
Can you dive into the similarities between Sarah, Hester, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's take on everything in the Scarlet Letter?
Yeah. Well, I read The Scarlet Letter in high school, like I'm pretty sure most of America did.
Yep.
And, I found it to be very dense and
Yes.
difficult to get through.
Yes.
But I think the spirit of the story was fascinating. And,
Yes.
I think that one of the reasons why this book, of all the books I've written, this is my 4th, has been my favorite. Don't tell my editor, but this is my favorite because the feeling that I get of disgust of like a Sarah Worthing, who is one of the women who sat on the stand and I think lied, frankly, about
Sure.
Sarah having an affair with her brother-in-law. I mean, just coming up with all of these terrible
Yeah.
things that were never proven just
Mhm.
to get this guy out of trouble, this Methodist minister out of trouble. All of that echoes through The Scarlet Letter clearly, which was written
Mhm.
about 18 years or so after. No, Scarlet Letter, it was written in 1850. So, yeah, almost 20 years later. Nathaniel Hawthorne was in Salem, and he went to this fantastic wax museum, and there was a depiction of true crime of the day, and there was a depiction of the minister kind of like lording over a figure that was supposed to be Sarah Maria Cornell, and Hawthorne commented on it, and he was a huge fan of newspapers and of true crime in general. So, the parallels between Hester Prynne, I mean, being just ultimately shamed by the matrons of the town, and Sarah,
Mhm.
the same thing happening to her. The minute, of course, the minister, I mean, the main character
Yep.
aside from Hester Prynne is a minister, and, we have the minister in our story. They meet in forests, both of them, which, not to get too much into it, but the I would say one of the things that is the most upsetting that I think has been misreported about Sarah's story is, she is pregnant when she dies, and it is often said, I think, that she had an affair with the Methodist minister, and there's no evidence that they had had a consensual relationship. There is evidence
Yep.
that he sexually assaulted her, and that's how she ended
Yep.
up pregnant. So, the scene in the forest to me is very important, and then this is a retreat that Hester Prynne and the minister have in The Scarlet Letter is in the forest. Of course, there's the water theme. I mean, Sarah works on the water. She's on factories. So,
Yep.
I think a lot of this is a woman trying to do what's best for her child. And that
Yes.
is for me the center point of this story is Sarah Maria Cornell saying my child deserves better. I'm keeping her. I'm gonna
Mhm.
put her in, like, a daycare system and still work in the factory
Yep.
and, making demands, and then she's dead. And
Yep.
so, I think you see that kind of parallel in Scarlet Letter, demands and, pride and, like, fighting for something even though it would be, in some ways, easier to kind of, go back into the recesses, and that's not what either of these women chose. And also, what's
Mhm.
wonderful about both of the women are both Sarah Maria Cornell and Hester Prynne are gifted at, like weaving and
Yep.
sewing. I mean, these are, at crafting, and they use them to help other people. So, they talk about Hester Prynne kind of, helping people in the town, even though they won't even really acknowledge her publicly, but they're grateful for her help. And Sarah Maria Cornell had been kicked out of a house because people thought she was promiscuous, and yet a woman became sick in the house, and Sarah volunteered to take care of her, even though she was getting
Yep.
booted out of this house. And the
Yep.
woman who owned the house, who was kicking her out, said it was just the most generous thing she had ever seen. She still kicked her out, and then she regretted it
Yeah.
later on. But that's what I mean. I mean, she was an altruistic woman. She gave a lot of money to the Methodist church, to a
Yep.
church that ultimately turned on her.
So in the book, you set out to decide through a modern lens if Sarah committed suicide or if she was murdered.
Right.
And given that the death took place in 1832, Can you share with our listeners kind of what types of forensic tools were available at that time?
Well,
Which was pretty much nothing.
limited. My second book, American Sherlock, was set in the 1920s, and I thought it was pretty slim pickings back then. I mean, if you go
Yes.
back 100 years more, so there was no fingerprinting. What they did was actually, I thought, innovative, if not incorrect. There were very few forensic things available, and even fewer
Mhm.
forensic clues available in this situation. So when she is found hanging from a haystack pole by John Durfee, immediately, the men look at the knots that were tied. It was assumed
Yes.
that she had taken her own life, and there was a square knot, which is the only knot I can tie, at the top of connecting the rope to the haystack pole, but then around her neck was a clove hitch knot, which
Mhm.
your listeners might have remembered that is the knot that Dennis Rader would use sometimes, was a clove hitch,
Yes.
BTK. So, the argument, for murder was that you cannot tie a hitch knot yourself. You have to use, like, both hands, and you have to have a certain amount of strength. And I spoke to a forensic knot expert as well as Paul Holes, and they both said that's BS. Paul said, "I've seen people, who have just it has spontaneously turned into a clove hitch knot. It's not hard."
Yeah.
So, they are hinging this entire case on the idea that she could not have done this herself. She had to have had somebody else do it to her, and
Mhm.
that was incorrect. There was a rudimentary handwriting analysis. I mean, a lot of this is that, why who brought Sarah Cornell to this farm December
Mhm.
19th, 1832, when it was 20 something degrees outside and freezing, and she's by herself. And
Mhm.
there are letters that she kept that show somebody said, "Come to this place. We need to talk," presumably the father of the child. And
Mhm.
so, these were anonymous letters. They tried to compare them to Ephraim Avery, and nobody came to a definitive conclusion. And so part of the investigation I did was I hired a modern handwriting expert to compare them. And so, I think that they were so limited, it made the case really, really difficult to
Mhm.
tackle because there were no witnesses. There were witnesses in that, there were people that saw a lanky, tall guy
Mhm.
which, matched Ephraim's description, but nobody knew him. So nobody could say Ephraim Avery was there with her. I saw them together. They could just kind of
Yep.
offer vague assurances, and there was not very much else. He had, like, the dumbest alibi ever, which I describe as like a walkabout, on a
Yes.
tiny island where nobody he knew really was there, and he just had a lousy it's like a, "Oh, yeah, I was asleep I was at home by myself watching TV" alibi. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that they were very limited, very, very limited at the time, and the defense knew that, and they were able to leverage Sarah had made some mistakes in the past, and they were able to really, really exploit those mistakes to turn this on her character, not on his character.
As we've kind of discussed already, Sarah's death comes at an interesting time in history when mill work was becoming more common for young women. And not only that, but there was this religious movement that was creating some waves. So, can you illustrate for our listeners some of the unique elements of this case that sort of made it so popular to mainstream media, if you will?
Oh, I mean, I think the religious aspect of it was crazy. So there's often it is said that Ephraim Avery was the first minister put on trial for murder, which is not true. Somebody actually countered that years ago in the New York Times. There was somebody, and he was like 4 months before or something. Certainly Ephraim Avery was the more high profile case. To
Yep.
have a minister not only be on trial for anything, but let alone murder in the United States in the 1830s was pretty remarkable. To have a
Hmm.
Methodist minister, a minister within a religion that was so threatening that they were being tarred and feathered
Yep.
by people who were threatened by this newfangled religion. So there's that. There is a beautiful 30-year-old young woman who, had a troubled past, who men just fell in love with. She was, described as beautiful. And so there's that sort of idea that she is the fallen woman, and is he this lascivious, awful, religious man who, a
Hmm.
wolf in sheep's clothing, or was she this vindictive, slutty woman who
Yep.
was willing to take her own life just to get back at him for, and I will just say, because, you know, she had made some mistakes that followed her, and she wanted to join a new Methodist church, but she had to have a certificate of good standing. And,
Mhm.
Ephraim Avery had refused her. He said, "I don't think you're a good person." He at first said, "Okay, I'll do it." Then she confessed all her sins on paper to him, and then he used it to sexually assault her. But, in the meantime, when he said, "I'm not gonna give you this certificate of good standing, I don't really care what you say," that is what the people who stand behind him, his, supporters, say that's what triggered her, was that
Sure.
she was never gonna get into a Methodist church, he was not gonna help her because she was a slut, and that was
Yep.
that. So,
Yep.
you have these 2 plausible narratives happening. You have the
Yep.
vindictive woman attacking a guy who did nothing wrong except had some standards, and then you have, on the flip side of a disgusting, horrible, man who was using the pulpit as a way to seduce and it ultimately ended up, sexually assaulting a young woman who then felt so threatened that he had to murder her. So, there you
Yep.
go. I mean, there's 2 compelling stories, so what media then or now would not wanna report on that story?
Exactly. In the book, you highlight when Catherine, your co-author, when her biases are coming through in her work, which is
Yeah.
Fall River.
Mhm.
So how difficult was it during the process of sort of compiling Sarah Maria Cornell's story to combat this in order to stay true to a neutral journalistic viewpoint?
I mean, it was awful. I have a hard enough time policing myself, then I had to police another
Yep.
person, and
Yep.
and then I was telling somebody else, I don't know if people know this, but because I've worked in the 1800s so much, in the 1800s, you would have not just 1 trial transcript, but, like, 9 different versions. You would have all of these trial
Okay.
reporters come, because they would then turn around and print them and sell them. So, they were
Sure.
highly motivated. You could have gone out and made your own trial transcript and have, paid a publisher, and then you could have sold it. But the problem with that is each one of these trial reporters had their own slant. They were either hired by
Mhm.
the defense or hired by the prosecutor. I mean, the newspapers would hire them. So not only do I have to police myself, which is hard enough, then Catherine, then on top of that, all of these numbnut reporters who all had inconsistencies. So then I had to figure
Yep.
out who's the most accurate out of all of it. So it was very difficult. And also, I have a true crime podcast class that I teach at the University of Texas, and I tell them, we have to think about motivation. When you hear a crappy podcast, and I mean
Yep.
crappy as in they don't care about the victim, they're glorifying the killer,
Yep.
they're saying they're giving details that don't need to be given, that are violent or disrespectful, they're re-traumatizing family members. You have to think,
Yep.
why are they doing that? That's one of the first things I think. Why are they doing that? So when I started seeing inconsistencies with Catherine and her reporting, not that it wasn't accurate, but she was taking facts and sort of like mushing them to make
Sure.
them into the narrative that she wanted.
Mhm.
Sarah Maria went to her doctor and she was interested in terminating the pregnancy at first. She had several questions about it. He said she was considering it.
Mhm.
Catherine really skipped over that. I mean, she did not acknowledge it even for a second, really. I think she said basically maybe she half thought about it, but then realized that would be like an abomination or something. That's not what
Yep.
she said. She was scared of dying during the procedure. And then she revealed to her doctor that the minister who had gotten her pregnant had said, "Please take this oil of tansy. You can, terminate the pregnancy that way." But he said, "Well," the doctor said, "that dose is gonna kill you. He's trying to kill you."
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but the way that Catherine framed that was not there was no consideration at all about terminating the pregnancy because that would have not been appropriate for Sarah in
Yes.
1832. And Catherine was motivated, very highly motivated, as a lot of people were, to frame her as a martyr in a way. Perfect.
Sure.
She stole several different things. Catherine conflated them into like 1 or 2 events, and that's it. But there were more
Mhm.
than 1 or 2 events. And so she was very, very careful to show that Sarah is, as I call it, the perfect victim, that she, and because she really wanted to nail the Methodist and especially Ephraim Avery. But when she did
Yep.
that, to me, she became an unreliable co-author. She just did. I had to flip and go, who wants to do that? I don't want to go double check my author.
Yeah.
And I had to
Yeah.
because I didn't trust her. By the middle of the book, I couldn't trust her.
So that's kind of the perfect segue. So how difficult was it to research this case? Piggybacking off that would be like, how long did it take you to work on it, like confer with other experts and authors on the case, as well as sort of like verify the accuracy of the information? Like I'm picturing this was a very long and involved process.
Yeah, I would say the research for me was a couple of years, but I it's very deceiving with me because I get bored with one book, like I'm revising it or I'm reading over the paper or something, and then I decide I want to find the next book. And so it's
Sure.
deceiving because there's all this crossover. And then I had a friend of mine, Bill Brands, who is a fan, H.W. Brands. He's a fantastic nonfiction historian, and he always said to me, "You need to start writing as soon as possible." And he said, "I know you wanna do all this research." He's like, "I could research till the cows come home, but you have to start immediately." And so it
Hmm.
took a long time, and Catherine didn't make it easy. On the other hand, she made it very easy because she had done so much work. She had, collected these letters
Sure.
and transcribed, and she was accurate with her transcriptions of Sarah's letters from what I could tell. She had done, interviews with Sarah's family, which obviously I couldn't do 150 years later, although I
Yep.
did interview Sarah's family, modern family now. So there's a lot of stuff that she made things easier on me and then harder at the same time. The
Yep.
trial transcripts were rough. I mean, to have that many different variations and to kinda just go, "Okay, what's the most accurate thing?" There's a guy named David Kasserman who wrote Fall River Outrage, which is an excellent book, very good book on this case, and so
Hmm.
I actually had to trust him when he would say, I would read in his book and he would say, "So there are a gazillion trial transcripts. Here's the one I think is the most accurate," and then I would say, "I think he's right," and so that's the one I would lean
Yep.
to, so it was a collaborative effort, I would say.
So the book and its pacing does an amazing job like laying down the groundwork ahead of the murder trial that took place in 1833. And given the breadth of witnesses that were called over the span of the trial, how does it compare to a trial that you would see today?
Well, there were a lot of witnesses, and actually, I think the sad fact was, Catherine pointed this out, and then I had to verify, and she was right. I think the defense literally called twice as many witnesses as the prosecutor did, and she describes the prosecutor, and then I did research, and she was pretty accurate with this too. It's just sort of this guy. I think he died shortly after the trial. He was pretty
Oh,
sickly to begin with. I think it was Albert Green, maybe. He was pretty sick to begin with, and then, you know, the Methodist conference had hired these dynamo, like, states and or, US congressmen, senators to
sure.
represent Ephraim Avery. So, I think that that part of the trial was longer than I had expected. Usually, trials in the 1800s went on like a nanosecond. They were like 2 days, if that.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
this was very long because it was so controversial. I mean, it was this minister and this quote unquote factory girl, and they represented 2 parts of society that were on the rise, and it was
Yes.
scary. Factory girls on the rise was scary. I mean, it was independence with women. It scared the crap out of a lot of men. And then the Methodists scared the crap out of the mainstream Protestants. So it was all it was all very traumatizing for a lot of very traditional people in New England.
And when it comes to cases involving sexual assault survivors, how does her trial compare to others of its like today?
When I talked to Sharon Vinnick, who was the woman I interviewed, she was a sexual harassment attorney. And
Sure.
she said, she read through the trial transcripts and said, "Well, this is exactly what they would say now." She said, "However, this would not get into trial. All of this stuff, she's a slut this and all of that, it wouldn't get into trial. But
Okay.
because there's so many laws, but she said then it does slip in somehow. But this
Hmm.
was so blatant, what Sarah, the prosecutor was trying to defend against was so blatant. She slept with her brother-in-law. She stole all of this stuff. She acted like she was insane. She had numerous venereal diseases, none of which were
Yeah.
confirmed.
Yep.
So, really just systematically, if this were happening today, a judge would strike most of this stuff down as not consequential and inadmissible. And I will say
Yep.
even, Catherine Williams brings up several really nasty stories about Ephraim Avery that I'm sure were discovered before trial. They're not entered into evidence because they're not consequential, and then I kind of thought, "Why are her stories about venereal diseases consequential in this trial?" But Ephraim Avery's stories about being a complete jerk and, really vilifying this poor woman in his other church and humiliating her, how is that not consequential? So, it's interesting to compare those cases to today.
Yes. Can you explain to our listeners how Sarah's life may have gone differently in the same sort of vein as how Hester Prynne is portrayed in Nathaniel Hawthorne's book? Could you kind of make that comparison a little bit towards the end?
Yeah, I think that, Hawthorne maybe had hoped that Sarah's life could have turned out like Hester Prynne's, where she, in Hester Prynne's own way, gains independence and
Yep.
certainly self-respect and takes control of her own narrative, certainly more
Mhm.
than probably the matrons in her town of their own narratives. Sarah Prynne doesn't or, Hester Prynne doesn't have a man telling her, what to do, and so
Mhm.
she's raising her daughter, Pearl, and I think that that was his hope for Sarah. I don't think that he ever thought there would you have to be logical about the time period you're living in, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
there would not be a way for him to have totally absolved Hester of all of this and then going on and having a perfect life and marrying this perfect man, a rich man, and everything would be sort of dismissed. That's not
Mhm.
reality for Jacksonian America. But for someone like Sarah Maria Cornell, she really had visions of putting the baby into, like, daycare during her work as a factory worker. I mean, she really was planning for the future, and that's what
Mhm.
led her to her death, was making a
Mhm.
demand and saying, "We have the brother-in-law, her sister, and her doctor and an attorney all saying you must get child support from him. You have
Yep.
to get child support." And the attorney said, "You need to move to his state to get child support." So she was protecting her own child when she died.
Mhm. How important was it for you to share Sarah's story?
I think it's incredibly important because, Sarah Maria Cornell is women today. I mean,
Yep.
you are n there is it is a fact that pregnant women are at a greater danger of being murdered than women who aren't,
Yep.
and we certainly know now that Indigenous women are at higher risk than most other women are.
Yep.
So I think that one of the things that I love so much about true crime is that you are forced, very much forced, to talk about issues that people don't wanna talk about. We talk about
Mhm.
domestic violence, we talk about mental illness, we talk about, personality disorders, you talk about gun control, you talk about all of these
Mhm.
different things. Women who are marginalized, women who are victimized, women who are survivors, and so I think that was really important. Our audience, yours and mine, our podcast audience, as you know, is probably 80% women. And
Sure. Yep.
they are pretty much all, as far as I can tell, 100% advocates, and many of them themselves are survivors.
Yep.
And they really want these stories to be told with respect. They don't
Yep.
want the killers glorified in any way.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
we are at this inflection point in true crime where we have a lot of, like, content creators who don't know what they're doing and
Yep.
who do everything wrong. And, my true crime podcast class listens to some of the podcasts that I say, "Okay, let's listen to one of these episodes," and they just walk away and go, "This is gross." And I said, "That's why we're listening
Yeah.
to it. You need to know
Yep.
what kind of podcast, what kind of TV series you don't wanna support, because it just
Yes.
is not good. These are real people. Even my
Yep.
people from, the 1800s, 1700s, people still care about them."
So I didn't write this question down, but I really want to ask it. Do you think had the matrons not spoken up, had John Durfee not spoken up, do you think we would even know about Sarah today?
Nope, it would have been a suicide. She was in the ground. I mean,
Yeah.
they disinterred her twice. She's in
Yep.
her 2nd burial spot now because these women, again, people I count as the heroes, because these women saw what they described as rash violence on her and said, "This is wrong." And
Mhm.
then, John Durfee, the owner of the farm, retrieves her belongings from Mrs. Hathaway's boarding house and finds that ominous note, which essentially says, "If I'm missing, talked to Reverend Ephraim Avery. And,
Yep.
which is a note that echoes through mysteries and thrillers for, throughout time. If I go
Mhm.
missing, call my husband. He's the one who did it.
Yep.
So, I know, I think it really was the matrons who saw her, and of course, these days it would have been, a pathologist or medical examiner or
Yep.
mortician, whoever is in charge of which could have been a man, absolutely, but in the 1800s, when you have a coroner's jury and they're all men, they're not gonna take her dress off. I mean, they didn't
Yep.
notice anything. She was fully clothed in a bonnet and calash, and I mean, it would have been, in their eyes, inappropriate to examine her. They assumed it was a suicide. Her personal physician was there and said she was pregnant. She was really upset about it. This is a
Mhm.
suicide. And so that's the way this went down, and man, does that happen now, you
Yep.
know? Yep, he was miserable. Oh, yeah, he talked about suicide. Yeah, but did he do it this time? Did the guy kill himself this time? Is that what
Yep.
happened? And,
Yep.
so I think without these women intervening, yes, this would have not been a story.
I kinda wanna go back to John Durfee, to him going and taking the time to actually get her belongings to kind of
Mhm.
see if there were any other clues or anything in there without really realizing himself that he was going and getting clues probably.
No, yeah.
Do you think to some extent, given that she copied down some of the notes that she received from Ephraim, do you think maybe in the back of her mind she worried that this was gonna be the outcome of this meeting, that she was going to be attacked?
I don't think she thought that. I think that they said that Mrs. Hathaway and her daughter said she was in a great mood because she thought she
Yeah.
was gonna get money and this would be settled.
Yep.
When she left, I don't think she thought she was going to her death. I had another interviewer ask me, say, "Man, Doctor Wilbur, what terrible advice," saying, "Meet up with him to get money," and I said, "Well, Doctor Wilbur said meet up with him, don't go by yourself if you're gonna do that, take a
Yep.
man with you." So, I don't think she thought, like many women don't think, that he was capable of murder.
Sure.
And I think that she copied those notes as insurance policies. That was very smart. And
Yep.
I don't remember if I put this in the book, but the handwriting analysis, it was interesting because, Sarah copied over one of his letters, and the handwriting expert was trying to compare Sarah's handwriting to Ephraim Avery's handwriting, because
Yep.
the idea was that the defense said, "Oh, well, she wrote all these anonymous letters herself. She was excellent at mimicking other people's handwriting." And she said, "I've never had an example like this where I could compare the anonymous note, the note's handwriting, to Sarah's handwriting word for word, because she copied the note word for word." And she said,
Yep.
"Clearly, she did not write that note. It's clear she didn't do it,
Yep.
that somebody else did."
Yep.
So it's interesting how smart she was. She was very, very smart about these insurance
Yep.
policies, and she does mention his name later on. So I think that there was a lot. Thank goodness for letters. I worry about people 50 to 100 years from now who wanna do true crime, and what are they gonna do without all of these letters? I guess they can petition for emails. I don't know. I guess we'll
Or,
see.
like, text messages, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, letters say so much.
Yep, and you did mention that in the book, by the way.
Oh, good.
So is there anything else regarding The Sinners All Bow that I may have missed that you'd like to share with our listeners as we're kind of winding down the interview?
No, I think, as I said, the most important thing for me was to tell the stories of these powerful women. I don't always agree with
Mhm.
them. So,
Yep.
I think that my co-author, Catharine Read Arnold Williams, I feel like her heart was in the right place, but I definitely think she was manipulating the storyline, and I really wanted to
Yep.
correct that. But I think that, you have the inspiration of these women, and I think you see that as a writer. I see things where I admire Catherine. She was the main breadwinner of her house. I am in mine. She's raising, a young girl. I have 2 kids. She's, really kind of hitting her stride in midlife, so am I. So I really admire a lot about her. And then I could see the way that she looked at someone like Sarah Maria Cornell, because Catherine Williams made a terrible decision with whom she married. She made a bad
Mhm.
decision. Sarah Maria Cornell's mother made a terrible decision about who she married, and that's why Sarah was in the position she was in. Her family got kicked out, of their very wealthy family, the Cornell family.
Yep.
And then Sarah, arguably made a bad decision by continuing, unfortunately, to go back to you never wanna blame the victim, but boy, is she I wish somebody had advised her to stop trusting him.
Yep.
And, he was excellent at manipulating her, and so I felt like there were women in this story who I looked at with a lot of admiration, including Sarah Maria Cornell, but and then, you just think, "Oh my gosh," like, if just one thing had changed, if something were
Yep.
different, they would be in a completely different position, you know?
Yep.
But it's I think, a wonderful book. I love it. I loved writing it. It was wonderful.
I had a hard time putting it down. There were
Hmm.
times when I was like, "I need to go to bed. I need to stop reading this for today
Thank you.
and just pick it up tomorrow." But yeah, I would kind of echo that sentiment that to me it read like a classic case of narcissistic manipulation
Yeah,
where he's like teasing her back, trying to spin this narrative where
yeah,
he's going to take care of her, she just has to do this, but make sure you don't share these letters with anybody, like, keep it
yeah,
to yourself,
yeah,
and it's just I pictured so many stories that you hear today of domestic abuse survivors and things of that nature where I was just like, "Man, like, if only she may have said something or, like, asked somebody to go with her, just
yeah. But, I
would we
mean,
even be talking about it?" And
she was not I mean, look at this I gotta tell you, I mean, look at the story my kid's watching the story of Gabby Petito right now. It feels very
yes.
much like Gabby Petito trusting the wrong person, you
Yep.
know? But, I mean, Gabby Petito has amazing parents, and
Yep.
they didn't know. They didn't know.
Yep.
Or how could I expect Sarah Cornell to pick up on anything from that guy, when
Yep.
he had manipulated so many other people? So, it's a really hard story in a lot of ways because she had had an incredibly difficult life. She was doing the best she could. She was a
Yep.
wonderful person, and, ultimately ends up dying by herself, be in the cold, alone on a farm for hours before somebody finally found her. And
Yep.
then, whether she received justice is arguable at this point.
Well, I don't have any more questions, but
Okay.
I would like to thank you for joining me today. And before we go, can you tell our listeners where they can buy the book and if there's anything else that you'd like them to know about you and your future books that are going to be coming out?
No, I think, you can buy books wherever you buy books. I love shopping local, but,
Yep.
everybody has their choices there. It's an audiobook. I read the audiobook in case people prefer audio. Moving forward, I'm definitely experimenting with fiction a little bit more. I adore nonfiction, and I won't stop doing nonfiction, but, I like to branch out. Storytelling for me is the most important thing. The mode actually doesn't matter in some ways. It's more of like, can I get
Yep.
a story out that moves you and makes you think,
Yep.
you know? So that's the goal.
Well, on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and we'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.